6 years since, I published a book entitled The Huguenots, Their Settlements, Churches, and Industries in England and Ireland. Its object was to give an account of the causes which led to the large migrations of foreign Protestants from Flanders and France into England, and to describe their effects upon English industry as well as English history. It was necessary to give a brief resume of the history of the Reformation in France down to the dispersion of the Huguenots and the suppression of the Protestant religion by Louis XIV, under the terms of the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. Under that act, the profession of Protestantism was proclaimed to be illegal and subject to the severest penalties. Hence, many of the French Protestants who refused to be converted and had the means of emigrating were under the necessity of leaving France and endeavoring to find personal freedom and religious liberty elsewhere. The refugees found protection in various countries. The principal portion of the immigrants from Languedoc and the southeastern provinces of France crossed the frontier into Switzerland and settled there, or afterwards proceeded into the states of Prussia, Holland, and Denmark, as well as into England and Ireland. The chief number of immigrants from the northern and western seaboard provinces of France emigrated directly into England, Ireland, America, and the Cape of Good Hope. In my previous work, I endeavored to give as accurate a description as was possible of the immigrants who settled in England and Ireland, to which the American editor of the work, the Honorable G.P. Dissosway, has added an account of those who settled in the United States of America. But besides the Huguenots, who contrived to escape from France during the dragonnades which preceded and the persecutions which followed the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, there was still a very large number of Huguenots remaining in France who had not the means wherewith to fly from their country. These were the poorer people, the peasants, the small farmers, the small manufacturers, many of whom were spoiled of their goods for the very purpose of preventing them from emigrating. They were consequently under the necessity of remaining in their native country, whether they changed their religion by force or not. It is to give an account of these people as a supplement to my former book that the present work is written. It is impossible to fix precisely the number of the Huguenots who left France to avoid the cruelties of Louis XIV, as well as of those who perforce remained to endure them. It shakes one's faith in history to observe the contradictory statements published with regard to French political or religious facts, even of recent date. A general impression has long prevailed that there was a massacre of Saint Bartholomew in Paris in the year 1572, but even that has recently been denied or softened down into a mere political squabble. It is not, however, possible to deny the fact that there was a revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, though it has been vindicated as a noble act of legislation, worthy even of the reputation and character of Louis the Great. No two writers agree as to the number of French citizens who were driven from their country by the revocation. A learned Roman Catholic, Mr. Charles Butler, states that only 50,000 persons retired from France, whereas M. Cape Figue, equally opposed to the Reformation, who consulted the population tables of the period, although the intendants made their returns as small as possible in order to avoid the reproach of negligence, calculates the emigration at 230,000 souls, namely 1,580 ministers, 2,300 elders, 15,000 gentlemen, the remaining consisting almost entirely of traders and artisans. These returns, quoted by M. Cape Figue, were made only a few years after the revocation, although the emigration continued without intermission for many years later. M. Charles Coquerel says that whatever horror may be felt for the massacre of Saint Bartholomew of 1572, the persecutions which preceded and followed the Act of Revocation in 1685 kept France under a perpetual Saint Bartholomew for about 60 years. During that time, it is believed that more than 1 million Frenchmen either left the kingdom or were killed, imprisoned, or sent to the galleys in their efforts to escape. The intendant of Saint-Tong, a king's officer not likely to exaggerate the number of emigrants, reported in 1698, long before the emigration had ceased, that his province had lost 100,000 reformers. Languedoc suffered far more, whilst Boulainvilliers reports that besides the immigrants who succeeded in making their escape, the province lost not fewer than 100,000 persons by premature death, the sword, strangulation, and the wheel. The number of French immigrants who resorted to England may be inferred from the fact that at the beginning of last century there were not fewer than 35 French Protestant churches in London alone, at a time when the population of the metropolis was not 1/4 of what it is now, while there were other large French settlements at Canterbury, Norwich, Southampton, Bristol, Exeter, etc., as well as at Dublin, Lisburn, Potarlington, and other towns in Ireland. Then, with respect to the much larger number of Protestants who remained in France after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, there is the same difference of opinion. A deputation of Huguenot pastors and elders who waited upon the Duc de Noailles in 1682 informed him that there were then 1,800,000 Protestant families in France. 30 years after that date, Louis XIV proclaimed that there were no Protestants whatever in France, that Protestantism had been entirely suppressed, and that anyone found professing that faith must be considered as a relapsed heretic and sentenced to imprisonment, the galleys, or the other punishments to which Protestants were then subject. After an interval of about 75 years, during which Protestantism, though suppressed by the law, contrived to lead a sort of underground life, the Protestants meeting by night and sometimes by day in caves, valleys, moors, woods, old quarries, hollow beds of rivers, or, as they themselves called it, in the desert, they at length contrived to lift their heads into the light of day, and then Rabot, Saint Etienne, stood up in the Constituent Assembly at Paris in 1787 and claimed the rights of his Protestant fellow countrymen, the rights of 2 million useful citizens. Louis XVI granted them an edict of tolerance. About 100 years after Louis XIV had revoked the Edict of Nantes, but the measure proved too late for the king and too late for France, which had already been sacrificed to the intolerance of Louis XIV and his Jesuit advisors. After all the sufferings of France, after the cruelties to which her people have been subjected by the tyranny of her monarchs and the intolerance of her priests, it is doubtful whether she has yet learned wisdom from her experience and trials. France was brought to ruin a century ago by the Jesuits, who held the entire education of the country in their hands. They have again recovered their ground, and the Congreganistes are now what the Jesuits were before. The sans-culottes of 1793 were the pupils of the priests. So were the communists of 1871. Monsieur M. Edgar Quinet has recently said to his countrymen, "The Jesuitical and clerical spirit which has sneaked in among you and all your affairs has ruined you. It has corrupted the spring of life. It has delivered you over to the enemy. Is this to last forever? For heaven's sake, spare us at least the sight of a Jesuits' republic as the coronation of our century." In the midst of these prophecies of ruin, we have M. Voyot frankly avowing his ultramontane policy in the Univers. He is quite willing to go back to the old burnings, hangings, and quarterings to prevent any freedom of opinion about religious matters. For my part, he says, I frankly avow my regret, not only that John Huss was not burnt sooner, but that Luther was not burnt too. And I regret further that there has not been some prince sufficiently pious and politic to have made a crusade against the Protestants. Envoyeux is perhaps entitled to some respect for boldly speaking out what he means and thinks. There are many amongst ourselves who mean the same thing without having the courage to say so, who hate the Reformation quite as much as Envoyeux does, and would like to see the principles of free examination and individual liberty torn up root and branch. With respect to the proposed crusade against Protestantism, it will be seen from the following work that the pious and politique Louis XIV attempted, and how very inefficient his measures eventually proved in putting down Protestantism or in extending Catholicism. Louis XIV found it easier to make martyrs than apostates, and discovered the hanging, banishment, the galleys, and the sword were not amongst the most successful of converters. The history of the Huguenots during the time of their submergence as an underground church is scarcely treated in the general histories of France. Courtly writers blot them out of history as Louis XIV desired to blot them out of France. Most histories of France published in England contain little notice of them. Those who desire to pursue the subject further will obtain abundant information, more particularly from the following works. Elie Benoit, Histoire de l'Édit de Nantes. Charles Coquerel, Histoire des Églises du Désert. Napoléon Peyrat, Histoire des Pasteurs de Désert. Antoine Court, Histoire des Troubles de Cévennes. Edmund Hughes, Histoire de la Restauration du Protestantisme en France. Au 18e siècle. Et Bonnemere, Histoire des Camisards. Adolphe Dichel, Le Roi et les Protestantes. Athanas Coquerel Fils, Les Forcats pour la foi, etc., etc. It remains to be added that part of this work, viz., the Wars of the Camisards and the Journey in the Country of the Vaudois, originally appeared in Good Words. SS, London, October 1873. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes was signed by Louis XIV of France on the 18th of October, 1685, and published 4 days afterwards. Although the revocation was a personal act of the king, it was nevertheless a popular measure approved by the Catholic Church of France and by the great body of the French people. The king had solemnly sworn at the beginning of his reign to maintain the tolerating edict of Henry IV, the Huguenot being amongst the most industrious, enterprising, and loyal of his subjects, but the advocacy of the king's then Catholic mistress, Madame de Maintenon, and of his Jesuit confessor, Père Lachaise, overcame his scruples, and the deed of revocation of the edict was at length signed and published. The aged Chancellor Letellier was so overjoyed at the measure that on affixing the great seal of France to the deed, he exclaimed in the words of Simeon, Lord, 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 now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace, for mine eyes have seen thy salvation, Lord, Lord, Lord. 3 months later, the great Bossuet, the eagle of Meaux, preached the funeral sermon of Letellier, in the course of which he testified to the immense joy of the church at the revocation of the edict. Let us, said he, expand our hearts. Let us expand our hearts in praises of the piety of Louis. Let our acclamations ascend to heaven, and let us say to this new Constantine, this new Theodosius, this new Marcian, this new Charlemagne, what the 36 fathers formerly said in the Council of Chalcedon. You have affirmed the faith. You have exterminated the heretics. It is a work worthy it is. Thanks to you, thanks to you, thanks to you, heresy is no more. God alone can have worked this marvel. King of heaven, preserve the king of earth. It is the prayer of the church. It is the prayer of the bishops. Madame the Maintenon also received the praises of the church. All good people, said the Abbé de Choisy, the Pope, the bishops, and all the clergy, rejoice at the victory of Madame de Maintenon. Madame enjoyed the surname of Director of the Affairs of the Clergy, and it was said by the ladies of Saint Cyr, an institution founded by her, that the cardinals and the bishops knew no other way of approaching the king save through her. It is generally believed that her prize for obtaining the king's consent to the act of revocation was the withdrawal by the clergy of their opposition to her marriage with the king, and that the two were privately united by the Archbishop of Paris at Versailles a few days after, in the presence of Père Lachaise and 2 more witnesses. But Louis XIV never publicly recognized de Maintenon as his wife, never rescued her from the ignominious position in which she originally stood, related to him. People at court all spoke with immense praises of the king's intentions with respect to destroying the Huguenots. Killing them off was a matter of badinage with the courtiers. Madame de Maintenon wrote to the Duc de Noailles, "The soldiers are killing numbers of the fanatics. They hope soon to free Languedoc of them." That piquant letter writer, Madame de Sévigné, often referred to the Huguenots. She seems to have classed them with criminals or wild beasts. When residing in Low Brittany during a revolt against the Gabelle, a friend wrote to her, "How dull you must be." "No," replied Madame de Sévigné, "we are not so dull. Hanging is quite a refreshment." Hanging is quite a refreshment to me. They have just taken 24 or 30 of these men and are going to throw them off. A few days after the edict had been revoked, she wrote to her cousin Bussy at Paris, "You have doubtless seen the edict by which the king revokes that of Nantes. There is nothing so fine as that which it contains, and never has any king done, or ever will do, a more memorable act." Bussy replied to her, "I immensely admire the conduct of the king in destroying the Huguenots. The wars which have been waged against them, and the Saint Bartholomew have given some reputation to the sect. His Majesty has gradually undermined it, and the edict he has just published, maintained by the dragoons and the Bourdaloue." Bourdaloue had just been sent from the Jesuit church of St. Louis at Paris to Montpellier to aid the dragoons in converting the Protestants and bringing them back to the church. Maintained by the dragoons and by Bourdaloue will soon give them the coup de grace. In a future letter to Count Bussy, Madame de Sévigné informed him of a dreadfully fatiguing journey which her son-in-law, M. de Grignan, had made in the mountains of Dauphiny to pursue and punish the miserable Huguenots, who issued from their holes and vanished like ghosts to avoid extermination. De Baville, however, the lieutenant of Languedoc, kept her in good heart. In one of his letters, he said, "I have this morning condemned 76 of these wretches, Huguenots, and sent them to the galleys. All all this was very pleasant to Madame de Sévigné. Madame de Scudéry also more moderately rejoiced in the act of revocation. The king, she wrote to Bussy, has worked great marvels against the Huguenots, and the authority which he has employed to unite them to the church will be most salutary to themselves and to their children, who will be educated in the purity of the faith. The purity of the faith, the purity of the faith. All this will bring upon him the benedictions of heaven, the benedictions of heaven, the benedictions of heaven.